All right, let's talk about Jon IV. Jon IV, I think, is simply a fascinating chapter. Um, in a meta sense, it tells us a lot about George R. R. Martin. It tells us a lot about his writing process, what was going on when writing a Game of Thrones, and what choices he made um, to get out of writing ruts and things like that. It tells us a lot about George's life and who he is. And there's a reason for this, and that as I was saying, uh, George got in a little bit of a rut during around the 1/3 point of A Game of Thrones, and he wrote a little slowly in the year 1994 before everything exploding in 1995. This chapter is not from 1994. It is from 1995, and it was inserted back. George, back in 94, was still writing, about Ned and Sansa and the Hands Tourney. And then, as I said last time, he inserted some Ned Stark Super Sleuth chapters, and he also inserted this Jon chapter. And this is a super interesting chapter because this is the introduction of Sam Tarly, and Sam Tarly, George has said many times, is the character that most resembles him. He's a very, and knowing George's life and his other writing, yes, Sam Tarly is very much George. George isn't obviously so much of a absolute wimp, and he doesn't whine that much, but there's a lot of similarities between Sam Tarly and George, and a lot of it has to do with courage, and a lot of it has to do with his relationship with his father. All of these things are sort of exaggerated with Sam Tarly, but George kind of sees his life in the same vein, and we have to remember, like, George is kind of stuck here on what to write with the Jon story, and so to get over this, he essentially inserts himself. Like he gets out of his writer's block by inserting himself, a character he knows a lot about, and then the writing flows because he writes a backstory to Sam Tarly that in many ways is his backstory. And so it just kind of goes. And if you notice, Jon 1 through 3 have nothing to do with what comes here. Jon 4, 5, 6 goes on this Sam Tarly plot. And because you can see that in the first 3 chapters, it's all about Jon learning to take on a leadership role. And the idea being, okay, Jon's eventually going to be Lord Commander, so he needs to become a good leader. But there's an absolute shift here with the Sam Tarly character. Instead, Jon doesn't rise because of his leadership ability. He rises because of his empathy towards Sam Tarly, which gets him the spot as steward for Mormont, which then has him go on the Great Ranging and things like this, and all these sorts of experiences. One could even argue that Jon doesn't even become Lord Commander because of his leadership. He becomes Lord Commander because of Sam Tarly and Sam Tarly's, wheeling and dealings. So in a sense, we kind of abandon what Jon was doing in the first 3 chapters, where that was growing, the speech from Donal Noy and all of that. And we take on a completely new plot with Sam Tarly, inserted later. He was stuck on Jon. He was stuck on all the chapters. And then this is put in here. We're going to get into a lot of very interesting stuff here when we get into Sam, but let's get going because this is a fairly long chapter for A Game of Thrones. Jon was showing Darian how best to deliver a side stroke when the new recruit entered the practice yard. Your feet should be farther apart, he urged. You don't want to lose your balance. That's good. Now pivot as you deliver the stroke. Get all your weight behind the blade. Now, as we can see, this is the Jon being leader role that he doesn't really ever take. Like, Jon he acts as somewhat of a leader during the Battle of Castle Black, but that's about it, right? Once he's Lord Commander, he's a bad leader. He has good morals, but he's a bad leader. And here he's being a good leader, but this isn't the reason he rises. Anyway, we meet Darian. Darian, of course, is our character we get to know a lot more in the Sam story as he goes to Braavos. and is eventually killed by Arya. Darian broke off and lifted his visor. 7 gods, he murmured. Would you look at this? Would you look at this, Jon? Jon turned. Through the eye slit of his helm, he beheld the fattest boy he had ever seen standing in the door of the armory. By the look of him, he must have weighed 20 stone. The fur collar of his embroidered surcoat was lost between his chins. Pale eyes moved nervously in the great round moon of his face, and plump, sweaty fingers wiped themselves on the velvet of his doublet. They told me I was to come here for training, he said to no one in particular. George R. Martin is, of course, is kind of a chubby guy. 20 stones for Americans, that's 280 pounds. George is also very, he's obviously insecure about his weight too. He's written a number of stories about fat people, including one called the Pear-Shaped Man and things like that. But he's very aware of his body type, and introducing himself here. This is George introducing himself as the first thing, is everyone being like, oh my God, look at that fat guy. So this is all like himself to an extreme, and his fears and his insecurity being really just put on the page. And this is one of the reasons why this chapter is very memorable and just really interesting. A lordling, Pip observed to Jon. Southron, most like near Highgarden. Pip had traveled the 7 kingdoms with Mummer's troop, and had bragged that he could tell what you were and where you'd been born just from the sound of your voice. We should put that in the fanfic later when we meet Pip again, him recognizing people's voices. A striding huntsman had been worked in scarlet thread upon the breast of the fat boy's fur-trimmed surcoat. Jon did not recognize the sigil. That's kind of weird. But nonetheless, what kind of education was Luwin given him? There's not that many important houses in Westeros. Tarly is one of them. Tarly is a very important house. If you're going to learn 20 houses in Westeros, you should know Tarly. But I think, I think maybe the importance of House Tarly was retconned and pushed up a little bit. Sir Alistair Thorne looked over his new charge and said, "It would seem they've run short of poachers and thieves down south, and now they send us pigs to man the wall. In fur and velvet, your notion of armor, my lord of Ham?" Of course, that's what Waymar Royce was wearing too. So, it's kind of funny because Sir Alistair Thorne is highborn. It was soon revealed that the new recruit had brought his own armor with him. Wow, we never hear about this armor again. We should bring that back. Padded doublet, boiled leather, mail and plate and helm, even a great wooden leather shield blazoned with the same striding huntsman he wore on his surcoat. As none of it was black, however, Sir Alistair insisted that he re-equip himself from the armory. That took half the morning. His girth required Donal Noy to take apart a mail hauberk and refit it with leather panels at its side. To get a helm over his head, the armor had to detach the visor. This is somehow he's got a big head. George R. R. Martin has a big head too. His leather is bound so tightly around his legs and under his arm that he could scarcely move. Dressed for battle, the new boy looked like an oversized cooked sausage about to burst its skin. "Let us hope you're not as inept as you look," Sir Alistair said. "Halder, see what Sir Piggy can do." Now, on all of this, okay, you got to remember that Sam is about, 19 years old, I imagine? He's older than Jon. Let me see here. I want to get his exact age, but he's the same. He's 17. I guess he's the same age as Jon. I'm sorry. I thought he was a little older, but nonetheless, that's the point being he's a late teenager, and you have to remember George R. R. Martin, what he was doing when he was a late teenager, and the big thing was Vietnam. Okay, George was very obsessed with Vietnam. Vietnam is a major theme of most of his writing, all the way up through the 80s. I mean, he describes himself as a man who had PTSD from not going to Vietnam. And he's written stories about Vietnam and war, and his writing is mainly anti-war because of Vietnam. And he's written about the what if of what if he had gone and things like that. There's a Twilight Zone episode that he wrote called the road not traveled, about what would have happened had he gone to Vietnam and things like this. So you understand, imagining himself in a military environment, somebody that he doesn't think he's suited for military, what that would look like, what are all of his fears. And that's what's happening to Sam Tarly here. He's essentially being sent off to Vietnam. He's sent off to join the military. It would just be a disaster, is essentially what George R. R. Martin is saying. Thank goodness he wasn't sent to Vietnam. It would have been a disaster. He's a lover, not a fighter. Jon Snow winced. Halder had been born in a quarry and apprenticed as a stonemason. Halder is one of Jon's friends. He's always around. He eventually, he doesn't go on the Great Ranging, but eventually he fights at the Battle of Castle Black, and eventually Jon sends him to the Shadow Tower in A Dance with Dragons because he sends away all of his friends. He was 16, tall and muscular, and his blows were as hard as any Jon had ever felt. This will be uglier than a whore's ass, Pip muttered, and it was. The fight lasted less than a minute before the fat boy was on the ground, his whole body shaking as blood leaked through his shattered helm and between his pudgy fingers. I yield, he shrilled. No more, I yield, don't hit me. Rastus and some other boys were laughing. Even then, Sir Alistair would not call an end. On your feet, Sir Piggy, he called. Pick up your sword. When the boy continued to cling to the ground, Thorne gestured to Halder. Hit him with the flat of your blade until he finds his feet. Halder delivered a tentative smack to his foe's upraised cheeks. You can hit harder than that, Thorne taunted. Halder took hold of his long sword with both hands and brought it down so hard the blow split leather. Even on the flat, the new boy screeched in pain. Now you can kind of even piece together what George is thinking. We've got these movies like An Officer and a Gentleman and Full Metal Jacket about what drill sergeants are like. The latter movie being about people going to Vietnam. George, all he had to do is see those movies and insert himself in that scene, which is what's happening here with Alistair Thorne. He's the drill sergeant, and now he's imagining like going to Vietnam. Jon Snow took a step forward. Pip laid a mailed hand on his arm. Jon, no, the small boy whispered with an anxious glance at Sir Alistair Thorne. On your feet, Thorne repeated. The fat boy struggled to rise, slipped, and fell heavily again. Sir Piggy is starting to grasp the notion, Sir Alistair observed. Again! Halder lifted the sword for another blow. Cut off a ham, Rast urged, laughing. Jon shook off Pip's hand. Halder, enough! Halder looked to Sir Alistair. The bastard speaks and the peasants tremble, the master-at-arms said in that sharp, cold voice of his. I remind you that I am the master-at-arms here, Lord Snow. Is again these two ideas coming to head that you can that being rough and mean to people will harden them versus, actually that might be traumatic, the other side saying actually that might be traumatic or it's pointless. Like there's different ways to lead. You don't need to pull the whole, officer and a gentleman routine on them. It's very clear that George R. R. Martin does not believe that the whole an officer and a gentleman way of leadership, Look at him, Halder, Jon urged, ignoring Thorne as best he could. There's no honor in beating a fallen foe. He yielded. He knelt beside the fat boy. Halder lowered his sword. He yielded, he echoed. Sir Alistair's onyx eyes were fixed on Jon Snow. It would seem our bastard is in love, he said as Jon helped the fat boy to his feet. Show me your steel, Lord Snow. Right there, I mean, the common thing when you're drilling these guys is to, like, right, accuse them of homosexuality, right? That's straight out of Officer and a Gentleman. Only queers and steers and queers are from Texas. Like, it's such a common thing to call people girls, call people gay when they're drilling them. Let's go, girls, run! Try to embarrass them. Denigrate them by claiming their women are gay. Jon drew his longsword. He dared defy Sir Alistair only to a point, and he feared he was well beyond it now. Thorne smiled. The bastard wishes to defend his lady love. Since so, we shall make an exercise of it. Rat, Pimple, help our Stonehead here. This is, all of the different nicknames. I think Rat is Rast, Stonehead is Halder, Pimple, who's Pimple? Do we know Pimples? I'm forgetting who. Albert. Albert is Pimple. Oh, there it is. It's the next sentence. Rast and Albert moved to join Halder. 3 of you ought to be sufficient to make Lady Piggy squeal. All you need is to get past the bastard. Stay behind me, Jon said to the fat boy. Sir Alistair had often sent 2 foes against him, but never 3. He knew he would likely go to sleep bruised and bloody tonight. He braced himself for the assault. Suddenly Pip was beside him. 3 to 2 will make for better sport, the small boy said cheerfully. He dropped his visor and slid out his sword. Before Jon could even think to protest, Gren had stepped up to make a third. The yard had grown deathly quiet. This is this idea that Jon is now pulling loyalty. Jon could feel Sir Alistair's eyes. Why are you waiting? He asked Rast and the others in a voice gone deceptively soft. But it was Jon who moved first. Halder barely got his sword up in time. Jon drove him backward, attacking with every blow, keeping the older boy on the heels. Know your foe, Sir Roderick had taught him once. Jon knew Halder. Brutally strong, but short of patience, with no taste for defense. Frustrate him, and he will leave himself open, as certain as sunset. The clang of steel echoed through the yard as the others joined battle around him. Jon blocked a savage cut at his head, the shock of impact running up his arms as the swords crashed together. He slammed a side stroke into Halder's ribs and was rewarded with a muffled grunt of pain. The counterstroke cut Jon off the shoulder. Chainmail crunched. The pain flared up in his neck, and for an instant, Halder was unbalanced. Jon cut his left leg from under him and fell with a curse and crash. So we get this, I guess George thought that there wasn't enough action yet, and so we get this quite a big thrilling action scene right in the middle of here. All these people, like, kind of illogically going to battle against each other, but here we are. Gren was standing his ground as Jon had taught him, giving Albert more than he cared for, but Pip was hard pressed. Rast had 2 years and 40 pounds on him. This is probably one of the reasons why I think I talked before about the 2 rapers that come up with Jon, and because Rast is also a raper, some people are like, oh, maybe Rast was one of those rapers, but we have no real evidence of that. I mean, Darien is also considered a raper, but the idea that the rapers from the Fingers that come up with Jon are like ragged peasants, and Rast is a fairly big guy, makes me think that it's not the same. Plus, Jon doesn't act like he knows Rast very much while he spent like 3 weeks with the rapers. But nonetheless, Jon stepped up behind him and rang the raper's helm like a bell. As Rast went reeling, Pip slid in under his guard, knocking him down, and leveled a blade at his throat. By then, Jon had moved on, facing 2 swords. Albert backed away. I yield, he shouted. Sir Alistair surveyed the scene with disgust. The mummer's farce has gone on for long enough today. That's of course Mummer's Farce is our big ice and fire kind of saying. And yes, Mummer's Farce has been used all the way back in Tyrion 1. So this is the second time it's used. He walked away. The session was at an end. Darian helped Helder to his feet. The quarryman's son wrenched off his helm and threw it across the yard. For an instant, I thought I'd finally had you, Snow. For an instant you did, Jon replied. Under his mail and leather, his shoulder was throbbing. He sheathed his sword and tried to remove his helm, but when he raised his arm, the pain made him grit his teeth. Let me, a voice said. Thick-fingered hands unfastened helm from Gorget and lifted it off gently. Did he hurt you? I've been bruised before. He touched his shoulder and winced. The yard was emptying around them. Blood matted the fat boy's hair where Halder had split his helm asunder. Oh, blood matted the fat boy's hair where Halder had split his helm asunder. My name is Samwell Tarly of Horn. He stopped and licked his lips. I mean, I was of Hornhill until I left. I've come to take the black. My father is Lord Randall, a bannerman to the Tyrells of Highgarden. I used to be his heir, only... His voice trailed off. I'm Jon Snow, Ned Stark's bastard of Winterfell. So we start getting a little bit about Lord Randall here, and it's of course unusual that an heir is sent to the wall, and we'll eventually get into why. But the watch is supposed to be for second sons, third sons, bastards, things like that. So we have an unusual situation here. And of course that all gets into, primogenitor, right? Like in medieval society, much of the time, not everywhere, because medieval society was a patchwork of laws, but much of the time, like the eldest son got all of the land. And there's reasons for that, is that when you're in an agricultural society, if you divide up your land by the number of kids, eventually in a couple generations, three or four generations, you don't have enough land to support a family, and they're not getting enough income. And this is actually a reason why like the potato famine happened, is that eventually like people started only growing potatoes because it was the only thing you could grow on small lots of land, and problems happened. Anyway, of course, primogenitor also has problems where the disinherited younger kids have resentment for the elder, and if you're training them to be martial people, they cause trouble. Maybe they might try to murder the eldest and all sorts of things. And you have all of these unemployed people with nothing. So, both systems don't really work, right? So, but nonetheless, this is highlighted here. Like, but this is, of course, contrasted bastard to somebody that used to be the heir. Samwell Tarly nodded. If you want, you can call me Sam. My mother calls me Sam. Now, of course, Sam is probably named Sam because of Frodo's companion and Lord of the Rings. You can call him Lord Snow, Pip said, as he came to join them. You don't want to know what his mother calls him, because he calls him nothing. These two are Gren and Pipar, Jon said. Gren's the ugly one. Gren scowled. You're uglier than me. At least I don't have ears like a bat. My thanks to all of you, the fat boy said gravely. I don't know if it's a coincidence or what, but, Pip is usually associated with being a bat, and Gren is associated with being a bull, oryx, and those are two of the companions at the Tower of Joy. You've got Went and the White Bull, Hightower, and it might just be a coincidence. But what does that mean? Is John Arthur Dane in that situation? What does it mean? My thanks to all of you, the fat boy said gravely. Why didn't you get up and fight? Gren demanded. I wanted to truly. I couldn't. I didn't want him to hit me anymore. He looked at the ground. I fear I'm a coward. My Lord Father always said so. So, George has been asked several times, like, why you have a lot of characters that seem to have problems with their fathers. Tyrion has a problem with his father. Brienne has a problem with her father. Jaime, of course, same father, problem with Tyrion, problem with his father. Sam, problem with his father. Dany would probably have a problem with her father, and everybody seems to have their daddy issues. Okay, Lysa, problem with her father. It kind of Quentin, problem with his father. Of course, Quentin is another stand-in for George R.R. Martin. But and so people have asked, like, have asked George, like, if he had a rough relationship with his father, and George has said that it was, of course, nothing like to the degree of what he's written with these other characters, but that he said he didn't have a great relationship with his dad. He said that the two of them just never talked, and that his father didn't understand him, and that they would talk about sports. And so if you really want to play, psychologist with George R. Martin, and you wonder why he's so into the Jets and the Giants. Well, the Jets and the Giants were the only thing that he would talk to his father about. It was their only connection. His father would essentially not talk to him, and that was their relationship. I don't think he describes anything close to the level of abuse that, like, Lord Randall has had, but he does say his father was an alcoholic. So that's the whole thing. You can kind of piece little things together, and plus, people don't like talking about this sort of trauma. But nonetheless, it's George had an alcoholic father who he said didn't understand him and didn't really talk to him, and they essentially just talked about sports. And so you get hints, like, though he's got this machismo, dad, and George is this kid that's into comic books and writing, So, and the coward thing, you got to understand that, like, late teens, George is we're talking about Vietnam, and George does not want to go to Vietnam, and he is scared of Vietnam, and he is morally against Vietnam. And this comes in later. Gren looked thunderstruck. Even Pip had no words to say that. And Pip had words for everything. What sort of man would proclaim himself a coward? And I want to really think about that, like, in George R. Martin's life, okay? He's a conscientious objector. Conscientious objector to the war. To many people at this time, maybe even today, they would proclaim George R. R. Martin a coward. And by being a conscientious objector, declaring yourself this, he's proclaiming himself a coward in many people's eyes, okay? What kind of person would do that? Samwell Tarly must have read the thoughts on their faces. His eyes met Jon's and darted away quick as frightened animals. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be like I am. He walked heavily toward the armory. Jon called after him. You were hurt, he said. Tomorrow you'll do better. Sam looked mournfully back over at one's shoulder. No, I won't, he said, blinking back tears. I never do better. Sam is almost comically unable to learn if anything physical, and somehow stays fat. And as much as we're supposed to reject Randall Tarly's, like, way of doing things, or Alistair Thorne's way of doing things, it's hard to argue that, like, at least as horrible and abusive as that way of thinking is, it's hard to argue that they wouldn't have some progress, that Sam wouldn't lose some weight, that he wouldn't get a little better at swords and arrows and things like that. It's a little unrealistic. I mean, the reason that Sir Alistair Thorne's way and Randall Tarly's way of thinking is so prevalent throughout history and throughout cultures around the world is that there is some results to it, and there's great costs, and we can all argue about whether the costs are worth it. I would agree with George that the costs are not worth the trauma, but it's also hard to argue that there wouldn't be some effects. So some people are really just flabbergasted. Like, no human being could be like Sam Tarly, like, and like not lose weight and not get better. Like, no human being is like that. But anyway, we continue on. When he was gone, Gren frowned. Nobody likes cravens, he said uncomfortably. I wish we hadn't helped him. What if they think we're craven too? This is a very teenager kind of middle school thought. You're too stupid to be craven, Pip told him. I am not, Gren said. Yes, you are. If a bear attacked you in the woods, you'd be too stupid to run away. I would not, Gren insisted. I'd run away faster than you. He stopped suddenly scowling when he saw Pip's grin and realized what he just said. Essentially, he just admitted that he was the best craven. His thick neck flushed a dark red. Jon left them there arguing as he returned to the armory, hung up his sword, and stripped off his battered armor. Life at Castle Black followed certain patterns. The mornings were for swordplay, the afternoon for work. The Black brothers set new recruits to many different tasks to learn where their skills lay. Jon cherished the rare afternoons when he was sent out with Ghost ranging at his side to bring back game for the Lord Commander's table. But for every day spent hunting, he gave a dozen to Donal Noy in the armory, spinning the whetstone while the one-armed smith sharpened axes grown dull from use, or pumping the bellows as Noy hammered out a new sword. Other times he ran messages, stood at guard, mucked out stables, fletched arrows, assisted Maester Aemon with his birds, or Bowen Marsh with his counts and inventory. Yeah, I mean, Donal Noy would definitely need more help. One blacksmith for the entire, like, it's just, one guy for the entire hundreds of people. It's just ridiculous, right? He would need to have a dozen apprentices. That afternoon, the watch commander sent him to the winch cave with 4 barrels of fresh crushed stone to scatter gravel over the icy footpath atop the wall. It was a lonely and boring work, even when with Ghost along for company, but Jon found he did not mind it. On a clear day, you could see half the world from atop the wall, and the air was always cold and bracing. He could think here, and he found himself thinking of Sam Tarly, and oddly, Tyrion Lannister. Now, in many ways as well, because Tyrion leaves the wall, and maybe this is why George had a little trouble, is that once Tyrion leaves the wall, Jon doesn't have anyone to talk to. Like, he's got the other people at the wall, but he doesn't really know what to do with them, right? And so Sam Tarly becomes that person for Jon to talk to, the other character there, to drive the story without, I mean, it's no wonder that Jon, that when, I've talked about, like, when George gets stuck, he, like, creates a new point of view character. And this is, even though Sam does become a new point of view character later on, like, this is very much pretty close to being a point of view character already. Sam Tarly is huge, enormous character for the Jon story. And so, I mean, after Jon, who else is there, right? So yeah, it's Tyrion's gone. He needs someone to take his place. He needs somebody to drive the story. He got stuck, and he's just like, I'll just shove in Sam Tarly. I'll shove in myself and the writing flowed. He wondered what Tyrion would have made of the fat boy. He'd probably make fun of him. Most men would rather deny a hard truth than face it, the dwarf had told him, grinning. The world was full of cravens who pretend to be heroes. It took a queer sort of courage to admit to cowardice, as Sam Tarly did. Um, Now I'm not certain that this line makes much sense. In the past, I've sort of uh, commented about how this is a fairly nonsensical line. However, I kind of get the gist of where George is coming from with it. So, in that, as I mentioned before, George wrote a story for the Twilight Zone called "The Path Not Taken," and where it's about a guy who was a conscientious objector and fled to Canada and then returned to America after the amnesty. And he all of a sudden begins seeing a disabled vet. And the disabled vet is him. And he's thinking about these two universes that existed, one where he went to Vietnam and one where he didn't. And reconciling the PTSD and the trauma and the guilt and everything related to that. And in the end of the story, the characters merge, and the final lines are something like these two men like were both on paths of courage or something. It's something like that. And so you gotta remember, like, George is claiming that yes, like people that were sent to Vietnam that were drafted and dealt with that, they are courageous people having gone through that. He admits that. But he's also saying that the people that objected, that didn't go to war, were courageous as well. And so what he's saying is that it's just two different types of courage. And so it's interesting that we run into the same sort of thing here, right? We've got the Jon Snows who like volunteer to go to the wall, and there's a courage to it. But then there's like, what is courageous about Sam Tarly? And what I think it's a little ham-fisted here, but I think George is trying to claim that like there is a courage to how Sam Tarly sees the world. Sam Tarly is caring and sympathetic, empathetic, and he doesn't want violence in the world. And his path is a courage. What George is saying is that Sam Tarly is courageous in his path as well. So I think that's where he's going with that line, that there is a courage to Sam Tarly. Now, John sort of like says it in like, oh, like by claiming you're a craven, you're courageous too. And I don't think it works. I think there's a better way that maybe George could have said it. Like had he been introduced to Sam's compassion earlier, maybe he could have talked about his compassion and sympathy being just as courageous as going into battle or something. I think that's what George was getting at with this line. I know I've given this line the business before, but yeah. Anyway, his sore shoulder made the work go slowly. It was late afternoon before John finished graveling the paths. He lingered on high to watch the sun go down, turning the western sky the color of blood. Finally, as dusk was settling over the north, John rolled the empty barrels back into the cage and signaled the winchmen to lower him. The evening meal was almost done by the time he and Ghost reached the common hall. A group of black brothers were dicing over mulled wine near the fire. His friends were at the bench nearest to the wall laughing. Pip was in the middle of a story. The mummer's boy with the big ears was a born liar with 100 different voices, and he did not tell his tales so much as live them, playing all the parts as needed. A king one moment, a swineherd the next. When he turned into an alehouse girl or a virgin princess, he used a high falsetto voice that reduced them all to tears and helpless laughter, and his eunuchs were always eerily accurate caricatures of Sir Alistair. John took as much pleasure from Pip's antics as anyone. It's interesting that he put eunuchs in these plays as if their eunuchs were all over Westeros, rather than just Varys. We don't meet any other eunuchs, really, in Westeros. Yet that night he turned away and went inside And when he went instead to the end of the bench, where Sam Tarly sat alone, as far from the others as he could get. He was finishing the last of the pork pie the cooks had served up for supper when Jon sat across from him. The fat boy's eyes widened at the sight of Ghost. Is that a wolf? A direwolf, Jon said. His name is Ghost. The direwolf is the sigil of my father's house. Again, this is something that Sam Tarly should definitely know, and Jon Snow should definitely know. Like, I mean, it's largely here for us, but yeah, come on. I mean, there's 7 great houses, or 8 great houses if you include the Greyjoys. I'm pretty sure Sam should know like what the sigil is, and Jon should probably know House Tarly's sigil. Ours is a strutting huntsman, Sam Tarly said. Do you like to hunt? The fat boy shuddered. I hate it. He looked as though he was going to cry again. What's wrong now? Jon asked him. Why are you always so frightened? Sam stared at the last of his pork pie and gave a feeble shake of his head, too scared even to talk. A burst of laughter filled the hall. Jon heard Pip squeaking in a high voice. He stood. Let's go outside. The round fat face looked up at him, suspicious. Why? What will we do outside? Talk, Jon said. Have you seen the wall? I'm fat, not blind, Sam Tarly said. Of course I saw it. It's 700 feet high. This line I felt, how Sam Tarly's, even though it's based on George, Sam Tarly is a little different. I always thought this line was more George because it's a little more biting. Sam Tarly is rarely biting. And I always thought this line was unusually biting for Sam Tarly. So I think George hadn't quite figured out the character yet. But it's funny for him to respond like, I'm fat, not blind. Like, does that sound like Sam Tarly? Yet he stood up all the same, wrapped a fur-lined cloak over his shoulder, and followed Jon from the common hall, still wary, as if he suspected some cruel trick was waiting for him in the night. Ghost padded alongside them. I never thought it would be like this, Sam said as he walked. His words steamed in the cold air. Already he was huffing and puffing as he tried to keep up. All the buildings are falling down, and it's so cold. A hard frost was settling over the castle, and Jon could hear the soft crunch of gray weeds beneath his boots. Sam nodded miserably. I hate the cold. Last night I woke up in the dark and the fire had gone out, and I was certain I was going to freeze to death by morning. It must be warmer where you're from. I never saw snow until last month. So let's keep in mind that George, for college, I mean, he grew up in New Jersey, which is, has outside of New York City, where that's seasonal, seasonal weather. And then he moved to Chicago for college. Chicago has seasonal weather, but it's extreme. So really hot summers, really cold winters. And then he moved to Dubuque, Iowa, where he said he never experienced anything as cold as being in Dubuque. And I think that led him to moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico for the rest of his life. He was done with the cold. Because he could have moved anywhere, and he chose Santa Fe. He spent some time in LA too, but so it's interesting here. It's like, I hate the cold. Well, George does hate the cold. He decided after Dubuque, I never want to do it again. So we were crossing the barrel, and me and the men my father sent to see me north, and this white stuff began to fall like soft rain. At first I thought it was so beautiful, like feathers drifting from the sky, but it kept on and on until I was frozen to the bone. The men had crusts of snow in their beards and more on their shoulders, and it still kept coming. I was afraid it would never end. Jon smiled. The wall loomed before them, glimmering palely in the light of the half-moon. In the sky above, the stars were burned clear and sharp. Are they going to make me go up there? Sam asked, his face curdled like old milk, as if he looked as he looked at the great wooden stairs. This is old milk. And now George loves to use. The pail is pale as milk, curdling like sour milk, curdling like old milk. His smile curdled, like old milk. I'll die if I have to climb that. There's a winch, Jon said, pointing. They can draw you up in a cage. Sam Tarly sniffed. I don't like high places. It was too much. Jon frowned, incredulous. Are you afraid of everything? He asked. I don't understand. If you were so craven, why are you here? Why would a coward want to join the Night's Watch? Why would a coward want to join the Night's Watch, right? Why would a coward join the military? Well, they have to be drafted, right? Isn't that it? So this is where, again, it's like little bits of George's story are like sprinkled here and there, Sam Tarly is what if George R.R. Martin were drafted? It's exactly that. And he's written these stories before, as I say, with the path not taken. Sam Tarly looked at him for a long moment, and his round face seemed to cave in on itself. He sat down on the frost-covered ground and began to cry, huge choking sobs that made his whole body shake. Jon could only stand and watch, like the snowfall on the Barrowlands. It seems the tears would never end. It was Ghost who knew what to do. Silent as a shadow, the pale direwolf moved closer and began to lick the warm tears off Samwell Tarly's face. The fat boy cried out, startled, and somehow, in a heartbeat, his sobs turned to laughter. Jon Snow laughed with him. Afterward, they sat on the frozen ground, huddled in their cloaks, with Ghost between them. Jon told the story of how he and Robb had found the pup's newborn in late summer snows. It seemed 1,000 years ago now. Before long, he found himself talking of Winterfell. And here we get, this is some weird dream stuff that's going to come back. Sometimes I dream about it, he said. I'm walking down this long, empty hall. My voice echoes all around, but no one answers. So I walk faster, opening doors, shouting names. I don't even know who I'm looking for. Most nights it's my father, but sometimes it's Robb instead, or my little sister Arya, or my uncle. This is like, him having dreams like this is never talked about before. But of course, he has later similar dreams. So this dream thing keeps coming back. So some sort of late addition that George had about the Jon character. The thought of Benjen saddened him. His uncle was still missing. The old bear had sent out rangers in search of him. Sir Jeremy Riker had led 2 sweeps, and Qhorin Halfhand had gone forth from the Shadow Tower. This is, of course, very interesting. The fact that we hear about Qhorin Halfhand so early in the story. Qhorin's name is spelled differently in the in these chapters. You'll see it's how it's Qhorin Halfhand. But yeah. But yeah, I don't know if this is fixed in later editions, but it's spelled. Qhorin Halfhand is mentioned twice in a Game of Thrones, and it's spelled weirdly, Qhorin. But apparently he somewhat knew that there was going to be a Qhorin Halfhand. But they'd found nothing aside from a few blazes in the trees that his uncle had left to mark his way. Yeah, so I don't know. At least he's somewhere. Both Qhorin and Jeremy Riker found some blazes in trees. In the stony highlands to the northwest, the marks stopped abruptly, and all traces of Ben Stark vanished. So, everybody talks about like where Benjen is, where Ben Stark went. Well, somewhere in the stony highlands is where things stop. So, I mean, that's roughly where Stone Snake is too. Those frost fangs and everything. So, the Stony Highlands to the northwest. Do you ever find anyone in your dream? Sam asked. Jon shook his head. No one. The castle is always empty. He had never told anyone of the dream, and he did not understand why he was telling Sam now, yet somehow it felt good to talk of it. Even the ravens are gone from the rookery, and the stables are full of bones. That always scares me. I start to run then, throwing open doors, climbing the towers 3 steps at a time, screaming for someone, for anyone. And then I find myself in front of the door of the crypts. It's black inside, and I can see the steps spiraling down. Somehow I know I have to go down there, but I don't want to. I'm afraid of what might be waiting for me. The old kings of winter are down there, sitting on their thrones, with stone wolves at their feet and iron swords across their lap. But it's not them I'm afraid of. I scream I'm not a Stark, and it isn't my place, but it's no good. I have to go away. So I start down, feeling the walls as I descend, with no torch to light the way. It gets darker and darker until I want to scream. So the crypts thing keeps coming back. People keep dreaming of the crypts. They dream of the crypts for a lot of reasons. They dream of the crypts because Ned's dead, or maybe the idea of Jon being dead too kind of comes into things, being cold. So, but Jon keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper. He stopped frowning, embarrassed. And that's when I always wake, my skin cold and clammy, shivering in the darkness of the cell. Jon being cold is this is part of Bran's dream too, I think, right? Ghost will leap up beside him, his warmth comforting his daybreak. He would always go back to sleep with his face pressed into the direwolf's shaggy white fur. Do you dream of Horn Hill? Jon asked. No. Sam's mouth grew tight and hard. I hate it there. He scratched Ghost behind the ear, brooding, and Jon let the silence breathe. After a long while, Sam Tarly began to talk, and Jon listened quietly and learned how it was that a self-confessed coward found himself on the wall. I think I've done, by the way, on this, I'm trying to remember what video series I did on this with, this all comes into Time Traveling Bran. I talk about all of the Jon's dreams, the reoccurring dreams. Anyway, and Jon being cold, the messages from Bran 3 visions. Right. Let me get back to that real quick. I want to make sure I'm not making stuff up. Yeah, he says he finally looked north. He saw the wall shining like blue crystal, and his bastard brother Jon sleeping alone in a cold bed, his skin growing pale and hard as the memory of all warmth fled him. So, I mean, this is a direct reference to Bran 3 at this point. Like, he, again, the wall was shining here. He's telling Sam about his dream of being cold in a bed. And of course, being cold in the bed is him thinking about the crypts. And, a lot of people also this is where a lot of the theories of Jon might go down to the crypts and find out that find out that there's something with Lyanna's statue and R plus L equals J, but they always leave out the fact that Bran is having dreams as well. So the Bran-Jon connection with these dreams is really important. You can't just take it from Jon's perspective alone. Okay. The Tarlys were a family old in honor, bannermen to Mace Tyrell, Lord Highgarden of Highgarden and Warden of the South. The eldest son of Lord Randall Tarly, Samwell, was born heir to rich lands, a strong keep, and a storied two-handed greatsword named Heartsbane, forged of Valyrian steel and passed down from father to son near 500 years. I guess they got it after 500 years, around the Doom of Valyria. Whatever pride his father might have felt at Samwell's birth vanished as the boy grew plump, soft, and awkward. Sam loved to listen to music. This is the thing, is Okay, like this is George R. R. Martin here. George loves music, writing, reading, eating. Okay, so remember all this. Sam loved to listen to music and make his own songs, to wear soft velvets, to play in the castle kitchen beside the cooks, drinking in the rich smells as he snitched lemon cakes and blueberry tarts. His passions were books, and kittens and dancing, clumsy as he was. But he grew ill at the sight of blood and wept even when he saw a chicken slaughtered. Too much, this is the thing, it's too much empathy. Too much sympathy. A dozen master-at-arms came and went at Hornhill, trying to turn Samwell into a knight, the knight his father wanted. The boy was cursed and canned and slapped and starved. One man had him sleep in his chainmail to make him more martial. Another dressed him in his mother's clothing and paraded him through the bailey to shame him into valor. He only grew fatter and more frightened until Lord Randall's disappointment turned to anger and then to loathing. And so this is this idea that that Lord Randall actually created Sam Tarly through the torture. That Sam might have grown up to be, a somewhat, martial guy had he not been traumatized by all of this stuff. Like he, that all of these people coming in, hitting him and starving him and stuff like that are the things that caused him to have the trauma. One time, Sam confided, his voice dropped to a whisper, 2 men came to the castle, warlocks from Karth with white skin and blue lips. They slaughtered a bull aurochs and made me bathe in the hot blood, but it didn't make me brave as they promised. I got sick and wretched. Father had them scourged. This is really interesting because this points to this chapter being written fairly late, or at least having this part inserted late. We hear briefly about a pale Carthene in the Dany story at the market, but the idea that they have blue lips, that there are warlocks with blue lips, does not come until Dany won A Clash of Kings. And so the idea that either he invented these warlocks here and then decided to pop them into the Dany story, or he kind of came up with these 2 ideas at once. And this chapter is written kind of later on. He was writing into Clash during his big boom period at the end of A Game of Thrones. Like A Game of Thrones kind of ends and he kind of just chops a point. And it's just like, okay, I've got enough pages. I guess I'm just going to stop here and split the books. He was going to keep going, try to finish off the War of the Five Kings, and so it could be that he had gotten far enough in the Dany story that, or close enough that he was thinking about these warlocks. It's really, really interesting because, again, this is a later chapter inserted, but I do wonder the distance in time between Jon IV and Dany 1. Anyway, I'm not sure, because of course he can come back and edit stuff, but finally, after 3 girls in as many years, Lord Tarly gave her husband a second son. From that day, Lord Randall ignored Sam, devoting all his time to the younger boy, a fierce, robust child more to his liking. Samwell had known several years of sweet peace with his music and his books, until the dawn of his 15th name day, when he had been awakened to find his horse saddled and ready. 3 men-at-arms had escorted him into the wood near Hornhill, where his father was skinning a deer. You're almost a man grown now, and my heir, Lord Randall had told his eldest son, his long knife laying bare the carcass as he spoke. You've given me no cause to disown you, but neither will I allow you to inherit the land and title that should be Dickens. I guess he's calling him Dickon, because he's more manly, men got dicks. Heartbane must go to a man strong enough to wield her, and you are not worthy to touch her hilt. So I have decided that you shall this day announce that you wish to take the black. You will forsake all claim to your brother's inheritance and start north before evenfall. Now, of course, in this universe, the maesters also exist, but I don't think maybe George had fleshed out what the maesters were. We know that later on in Feast, like George kind of makes it so that Randall didn't want to be shamed by having his son become a maester, but it doesn't really I don't know, it doesn't really like fit so well. I mean, it seems like Lord Randall would like Sam would fit maester lifestyle perfectly, and that Randall would be like, fine, just send him to be a maester. But instead he's like, no, you've got to go to the wall. Maybe it's because he loathes him or things like that. But it's also the way Randall speaks later is very different from this. Lord Randall that we meet, the Lord Randall we meet in A Feast for Crows has really short sentences. And these are long. You have given me no cause to disown you, but I will neither allow you to inherit the lands and titles that should be Dickens. You know, like it's a very different Randall. I think, you know, but you know, it all still fits, but it's definitely kind of a retcon that oh, actually, you know, he could have just made him a maester. Oh, but he was against him being a maester for some reason. If you do not, then on the morrow we shall have a hunt, and somewhere in these woods your horse will stumble, and you'll be thrown from your saddle to die. Or so I will tell your mother. This is what's kind of weird. Like, hunts they're big affairs, you know, like they're big affairs with many people. It's really hard to murder murder his son on a hunt. But okay, as if the two are going into the woods alone in private, but it's like no. She has woman's heart, and finds finds it in her heart to cherish even you, and I have no wish to cause her pain. Then why not send him to the Citadel, right? Like he doesn't want to cause his wife pain, but he's sending him to the wall. Like it doesn't quite fit. Like you have to admit, like please do not imagine that it'll be truly that easy. Should you think to defy me, nothing would please me more than to hunt you down like the pig you are. His arms were red to the elbow as he laid the skinning knife aside. So, there's your choice. The Night's Watch. He reached inside the deer, ripped out its heart, and held it in his fist, red and dripping. Or this. Sam told the tale in a calm, dead voice, as if it were something that had happened to someone else, not him. And strangely, Jon thought he did not weep, not even once. And when he was done, they sat together and listened to the wind for a time. There was no other sound in the world. Finally, Jon said, "Why did you go back to the common hall?" "Why?" Sam asked. Jon shrugged. "There's hot cider to drink, or mulled wine if you prefer. Some nights Darian sings for us if the mood is on him. He was a singer before. Well, not truly, but almost an apprentice singer." "How did he come here?" "Lord Rowan of Goldengrove found him abed with his daughter. The girl was 2 years older, and Darian swears she helped him through the window. But under her father's eye, she named it rape. So here he is. When Maester Aemon heard him sing, he said his voice was honey poured over thunder." Jon smiled. "Toad sometimes sings too, if you call it singing. Drinking songs he lured in his father's wine sink. Pip says his voice is piss poured over a fart." They laughed at that together. So we get a lot of, introductions. I think it's another way. I mean, this is the beginning of the story, so it's fine, but I think it's another way that George deals with writer's block, is to just introduce more characters. "I should like to hear them both," Sam admitted, "but they would not want to. They would not want me there." His face was troubled. "He's going to make me fight again on the morrow, isn't he?" "He is," Jon was forced to say. Sam got awkwardly to his feet. I had better try to sleep. He huddled down in his cloak and plodded off. The others were still in the common room when Jon returned, alone but for Ghost. Where have you been? Pip asked. Talking with Sam, he said. He truly is craven, said Gren. At supper, there were still piles on the bench when he got his pie, but he was too scared to come sit with us. Oh, still places on the bench. The Lord of Ham thinks he's too good to eat with the likes of us, suggested Jaren. Jaren. What happens to Jaren? Huh. He's around. He's around. He's just at Castle Black. We know what happens to Jaren. We don't know what happens to Jaren. Jaren, he's still a steward at the time of a Storm of Swords, and then vanishes from our story. I saw him eat a pork pie, Toad said, smirking. Do you think it was a brother? He began making oinking noises. Stop it, Jon snapped angrily. The other boys fell silent, taken aback by a sudden fury. Listen to me, Jon said into the quiet, and he told them how it was going to be. Pip backed him, as he'd known he would. But when Halder spoke up, it was a pleasant surprise. Gren was anxious at first, but Jon knew the words to move him. One by one, the rest fell in line. Jon persuaded some, cajoled some, shamed the others, made threats where threats were required. At the end, they had all agreed. All but Rast. You girls do as you please, Rast said, but if Thorne sends me against Lady Piggy, I'm going to slice me off a rasher of bacon. He laughed in Jon's face and left them there. Hours later, the castle slept. 3 of them paid a call on his cell. Gren held his arms while Pip sat on his legs. Jon could hear Rast's rapid breathing as Ghost leapt onto his chest. The direwolf's eyes burned red as embers as his teeth nipped slightly at the soft skin of the boy's throat, just enough to draw blood. Remember, we know where you sleep, Jen said softly. The next morning, Jon heard Rast tell Albert and Toad how his razor had slipped while he shaved. From that day forth, neither Rast nor the others would hurt Sam Tarly. When Sir Alistair matched them against him, they would stand their ground and swat aside his slow, clumsy strokes. If the master at arms screamed for an attack, they would dance and tap Sam lightly on the breastplate or helm or leg. Sir Alistair raged and threatened and called them all cravens and women and worse, yet Sam remained unhurt. A few nights later, at Jon's urging, he joined them for an evening meal, taking a place at the bench beside Halder. It was another fortnight before he found the nerve to join their talk, but in time he was laughing at Pip's faces and teasing Gren with the best of them. Fat and awkward and frightened might be, but Samwell Tarly was no fool. One night he visited Jon in his cell. I don't know what you did, he said, but I know you did it. He looked away shyly. I've never had a friend before. We're not friends, Jon said. He put his hand on Sam's broad shoulder. We're brothers. And so they were, he thought to himself after Sam had taken his leave. Robb, Bran, and Rickon were his father's sons, and he loved them still, yet Jon knew that he had never truly been one of them. Catelyn Stark had seen that. The grey walls of Winterfell might still haunt his dreams, but Castle Black was his life now, and his brothers were Sam and Gren and Halder and Pip and the other cast-outs who wore the black of the Night's Watch. My uncle spoke truly, he whispered to Ghost. He wondered if he would ever see Benjen Stark again to tell him. And so there it is, this long introduction, and it's kind of a story in and of itself. This one, this Sam story here, like if this could just be a short story by itself, right? Like it has closure to the end, but yeah, very, very personal. It's a lot of George in it, and it's quite good. It's quite good, and as much as like Sam Tarly annoys people and things like that, there's a lot of real emotion in this chapter. The backstory to Sam, and I think the reason that there's a lot of emotion in it is because it is George, and George is writing personal experience, very, very personal experience. He really cuts himself and bleeds on the page in this chapter, and I really do think Jon IV is probably one of the better chapters of all of Game of Thrones. It's not to mention that's great action in the middle, and things like that. Certainly, it's a chapter everyone remembers. So that's Jon. Next, we're going back to next time is back to Ned's Super Sleuth. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.